Now let's start. I'll give the floor to Giorgio. Thank you, Giorgio, for being here. And yeah, his intervention will be properly on forest and mitigation for climate change. So the floor is yours.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. I really appreciated the short talk by James Key that so nicely introduced the topic that I'm going to talk about today. Forest for effective mitigation of climate change. First of all, let's look at a snapshot of the carbon pools on our planet. And if we count how much carbon is stored in the different pools, so in soils, in forests, in the atmosphere, and also in the sea and in the ocean, we see something that maybe is unexpected for a lot of people, that actually soils and vegetation contain about 5 times more carbon, if we include also permafrost, than what is contained in our atmosphere. So this information alone speaks already by itself about the importance of preserving existing carbon pools. Think about, for example, the pools in tropical forests that are being depleted by the day due to deforestation and forest degradation in those areas. Forests, of course, are not the only vegetation on Earth, but they alone store between 450 and 650 gigatons, so billion tons of carbon. And where do they? Where we have about 2 very different situations on our planet at the moment. Some forests are really rich in above ground carbon. So the map in the top of this slide, and these are tropical forests that store most of their carbon in trees, leaves, branches, lianas, and all that we can see basically if we were to walk inside these forests. But there are also other forest ecosystems on the planet that store carbon where we can't see it. They store it below ground, in soil pool, in organic matter pools, and these are the ecosystems in the boreal area, so close to the Arctic, close to the North Pole, where the temperature is really low, the degradation of organic matter takes a long time, and so carbon is stored for a really long time in very stable forms in the soil. And this is, for example, why fires are a very high danger in this area, because they tend to consume the soil and to increase the flux of carbon from this high stock reserve in the soil up into the atmosphere. This is the same information, just seeing with a different infographic. As you can see, tropical forest, most of the carbon is above ground. Boreal and cool temperate forest, most of the carbon is below ground. And in fact, it can be a higher stock of carbon than that sequestered by tropical forest overall. The fact that ecosystems and vegetations absorb carbon thanks to photosynthesis is really important for climate change mitigation. In fact, of all greenhouse gases ever emitted by humans since the Industrial Revolution, so since 1750, about 50% only is staying in the atmosphere. The other half, the other 50%, has already been absorbed by ecosystems in equal parts by ocean ecosystems and land, including vegetation and forests. Of course, what matters is not only the fact that vegetation can absorb carbon thanks to photosynthesis, but also how long this carbon is staying in the ecosystem before going back to the atmosphere. And this is something known in ecology as carbon turnover time. So the ecosystems with a very high carbon turnover time are where carbon is stored in more stable forms. And again, we see the tundra, the boreal forest, where the decomposition of organic matter is almost always quite slow. On the other hand, we have tropical forests where the carbon turnover time is really fast, less than 15 years. So this means that for an average molecule of CO2 or an average atom of carbon, it takes about 14 years to go back and forth into the atmosphere while cycling through the complete ecosystem. And this also speaks for itself about the importance of preserving these very fragile safes, sinks of carbon, because it takes really a low effort for this carbon to go back into the atmosphere already by itself. And of course, here I have to mention deforestation. At a global level, the forest area is still decreasing, although at a decreasing rate, but we are still losing forest every year. And the emissions due to deforestation and forest degradation are about 3 billion tons of CO2 per year, which is slightly less than 10% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So of course, this is not the major part of our emissions, but it transforms into carbon, which is not good because we want them as sinks, and it adds up to the total volume of greenhouse gases, CO2 and other gases that we already emit with our energy productions and all other activities. Another event, another process that is responsible for a lot more is fire. Of course, not all fires are caused by humans, so a part of these emissions does not count for anthropogenic emissions, but count as natural emissions of the Earth system. But still, if climate change is increasing fire frequency, fire severity globally, we are about to face into emissions from fires. And this is the start of a feedback loop or a tipping point in some parts of the world where vegetation is less able to recover, to grow back after a fire. And if fires occur on a higher frequency, then we have higher emissions and lower sink capacity. So lower growth of forest, lower possibility of absorbing back some of the CO2 that was emitted during the fire. Globally, notwithstanding these threats, forests are still a global carbon sink. The net sequestration is about 4 gigatons of 4 gigatons of CO2 per year, but this is with deforestation. So the label of the slide is inverted. I apologize for that. So with deforestation, the sink is only slightly less than 3 billion tons of CO2. And the bars in this map represent the strength of the sink, different forests in the world, and the strength of the source due to deforestation. As you can see, for example, in South America, the source in some areas is almost equal to the sink. In fact, there are a lot of worries and some evidence already shows that, for example, the Amazon basin is slowly turning, or not so slowly turning, from a carbon sink into a carbon source due to deforestation, due to the increase in the frequency of drought and tree mortality and so on. Let's go closer to home, at least my home. This is the carbon balance of my country, the country where I live, Italy. And as you can see, the land use and land sector is currently responsible for mitigating about 10% of the country total emissions. This is slightly less than the global average, where forestry and forests are responsible for about 25% of mitigation. But this is because we don't have very large tracts of biomass-rich forests, and we have also emissions due to agricultural and other activities. But what do we talk about when we talk about carbon sequestration? There are different definitions and different ways in which we can account for carbon sequestered by a forest. And this is where complex. But let me try and clarify what are different phases, the different stages through which a forest stores carbon from the atmosphere. The first step is photosynthesis. So what we call the gross primary productivity or production of the global, all the CO2 that is absorbed from the atmosphere thanks to photosynthetic processes. A lot of it, about half, in fact, 50%, or between 47 and 52%, in fact, is immediately used by the plant in respiration. So plant cells have to live, have to carry out respiration just as our cells do through mitochondria. So they CO2 and they consume oxygen. So we call the net primary productivity all the carbon stored by photosynthesis minus the carbon used for respiration and emitted back immediately as CO2 into the atmosphere. But then not only plants have to be alive and to carry out cell respiration, also the soil hosts a lot of living beings, bacteria, fungi, animals. They also carry out respiration, so they also consume oxygen and emit CO2. So we have to take that into account as well. And finally, we have disturbances. We have seen human-induced disturbances such as deforestation, or natural or partially natural disturbances such as fire or wind damage. And all these processes are responsible for carbon emissions. So in the end, the net of all this is called the net biome productivity. And this refers really to the carbon that the forest ecosystem has stored, so has subtracted from the atmosphere thanks to its physical. This net biome productivity is very variable. We have to decide and see when it is highest and when it's lowest, and try to sustain it or improve it. And there are different factors that can improve or decrease the net carbon sequestration by ecosystems. One is age effects. So forests are alive, they are living beings with a given physiological cycle, and they go through different stages of efficiency, also in terms of storing carbon and carrying out photosynthesis. This is a graph of the light use efficiency, so the amount of carbon that is photosynthesized for a given amount of light or solar energy received by a leaf, for example. And you can see a very young age, between 40 and 50 years of age, approximately. This is when a plant is most efficient, or a tree, on average, for all tree species globally. The consequence of this is that the photosynthesis, the gross photosynthesis, has a peak around this kind of age, so 50, 60 years old. Respiration, on the other hand, tends to increase indefinitely, because as trees grow bigger, they have more leaf, more tissue to keep alive. And so respiration tends to increase forever with tree size and with tree age. So in fact, the maximum amount of stored carbon, our NPP, or net primary productivity, is attained at moderate age or intermediate ages. If the forest ages up, then its efficiency in storing carbon tends to decrease. It will still be a sink, so it will still sequester carbon, but at a reduced rate. There are a lot of researches. Of course, this is also in itself very variable throughout species, throughout climates and biomes of the world. But all the data that we have seem to confirm this kind of trend globally for both temperate. So you see a peak in net primary productivity between, in this case, 50 and 100 years of age. Of course, as I said, this depends highly also on the climate. The trees have to be healthy in order to carry out photosynthesis in a good way, in an efficient way. But trees have a lot of reasons not to be healthy. The first of all is climate change itself. So the different pressures of climate change can stress out the trees. Think about drought, think about heat waves, disturbances. There are, however, some aspects of climate change that, in theory, could benefit trees. And this is the increased amount of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. After all, CO2 is the food of trees, is what they eat for a living. So one could think, that increasing the CO2 would make trees happier and make them grow better and faster. And in fact, some models, some process-based models of tree and forest growth show us precisely this. If we take all other factors, if we keep all other factors equal, and we only change the concentration of CO2, then we see, for example, in Europe, that the future growth of most forests will increase, will be higher than what we have today. The problem is, in nature, not all factors can be kept equal. As the CO2 increases, so do also drought events, heat waves, and climatic stress in general. So there are limitations to this CO2 fertilization effect. We cannot count a lot on it. First of all, there is a physiological limitation, because no matter how much CO2 you provide to a leaf, it will eventually reach a saturation point at around 7 parts per million of CO2. Luckily, we are still far from this kind of concentration in our atmosphere. I fear that we will eventually get there in not a very long time, but this is a first order of limitations for CO2 fertilization. Then we have limitations from water. In order to carry out photosynthesis, a tree has to drink. But if it doesn't have access to enough water, then the photosynthesis will be limited. And we see, for example, evidence of this in a lot of forests worldwide. In fact, a lot of not only slow growth, but even mortality events are in global forest, including in these tropical forests that are so important for the carbon cycle overall. In the southern part of the Amazon, for example, where most also of the deforestation is focused, satellite measurements are actually seeing the forest shrink down. It's not the individual trees that are shrinking down, but the larger trees that do not have enough water to be alive, to be kept alive, they tend to die first. And the effect on the overall height of the forest is the height decreases after some years. And as I said, the large trees are in fact the ones that suffer first from limitations of water, because they have more tissue. They have a more negative water balance. They have a lot of requests for water. And so they are the ones that tend to show the lowest growth rate and the highest mortality rate when water stress occurs. For all these reasons, in fact, what we are seeing is not an increase in the sink fertilization, but rather a saturation, so a slowdown of the forest sink globally. And we are seeing this with different independent measurements, from satellites, from field-based measurement of carbon fluxes, such as from covariance towers that measure the CO2 that goes up and down to and from the forest. And we are seeing this both globally and at a European scale. So there has been a time until around 1990 when the sink of European forest was increasing, because the forest was growing faster, because it was also spreading around and increasing its area. But now, in the last 20 years, the first data from forest inventory say that the sink maybe is slowing down. It starts saturating. It doesn't increase anymore. And this, of course, is very worrying, because a lot of mitigation strategies count on increasing the forest sink to compensate for whatever emissions we cannot reduce. But if the sink decreases, then this opportunity is wasted. So this is one of the main worries of the scientific community currently. There are other measures, of course, of increasing and trying to counteract its saturation. The one that is most talked about in these days, is planting new forests in all areas where this is possible. There was a very widespread and read research published last year in the journal Science by the ETH, so the Zurich Polytechnic Institute, that tried to estimate how many hectares, what's the area where we can plant new trees globally. And the estimate turned out to be about 1 billion hectares, where we can plant about 1 trillion trees. And if this were to happen, according to this paper, once these forests will be mature, so possibly in 1 century from now, so we have to wait for a long time, they could be able to absorb about 1/3 of all the emissions that humanity has produced so far. This estimate has been very much criticized, subject to heavy scrutiny from the scientific community, and has since been tuned down a little bit. The most accurate data that also IPCC uses in his climate change and land report that was shown before by James Skee is that nature-based solutions for mitigation of climate change could provide just a limited part of the climate mitigations that we have to do if we don't reduce our emissions. So the message here is that if emissions keep increasing, then nature can do a smaller and smaller part with his job. And as you can see, in 2030, so 10 years from now, nature-based solution could provide at most 18% of climate mitigation. So it means that there's more than 80% of what we have to do in terms of reducing emissions, rather than asking the trees out for us. And then planting trees also has other issues. Wait for a long time for the forest to be functional, to be fully acting as a sink. Also, planted forests are not natural ecosystems. You have to choose the right species of trees. You have to choose the right place. You have to protect them from natural disturbances, from climate extremes, because we know that they are increasing. And also, there are a lot of negative consequences in terms of biodiversity. So the kind of trade-offs that James Key was mentioning before. If we plant a monoculture, if we replace a deforested tropical area with a monoculture, a productive monoculture, such as eucalypt, for example, then yes, maybe we are sequestering carbon, but we are doing a severe damage to local biodiversity. Important concept that we must always keep in mind. There are, however, other ways to increase or at least avoid a reduction of the forest sink. And one has to do precisely with disturbances. So as I've already said, all the observations and models for the future are telling us that forest damages, forest disturbances are in fact increasing, mostly due to climate change. In all biomes, in Mediterranean Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe, we have different kinds of disturbances. We have fires, insect outbreaks, wind damage. All of these are in fact increasing. So one option could be to try and prevent damage, or at least reduce potential damage to the forest. And by doing so, avoiding carbon losses by disturbances. So this is where forest management can play an important role in terms of increasing the resilience and the resistance of the forest to future disturbances. Managing forest fuels, for example, increasing the heterogeneity of the forest so that it can be more stable and more resistant to high winds, and so on. Third way of increasing the sink after planting and after preventing disturbances. When we are considering carbon, we don't have to limit our view to living trees. We have to assume a comprehensive view of the fate of this carbon, even after a tree has died, especially even after we have harvested that tree to use its wood. And this is because wood has the potential today to replace more climate-intensive, more carbon-intensive products, such as plastics, for example, cement, steel, or fossil fuels. All materials that are associated to higher carbon emissions for their production and disposal. For example, if we, let's say, if we have a forest like this is, by the way, a formal plantation. So plantations can not always lead to very nice outcomes. We have a very high fire vulnerability here. The growth is stagnating due to too high competition. So this should be one situation where forest management should be used to bring the situation back in equilibrium and increase the carbon sink. This is another situation, another example. By forest management, we can, and in fact, we want to accelerate the regeneration process. So make room, make light, free up resources for the new generation of trees to replace the ones that we harvest. And by doing this, we also keep the age of the forest in that area where net primary productivity has a peak. So photosynthesis is most effective. Let me skip some slides here. Going back to substitution effects, we are seeing a resurgence of the use of wood for building, for infrastructures, structures and infrastructures. And this is because recent progress in material technology can allow the use of wood even for massive buildings. There are skyscrapers, hundreds of meters high, that are being designed at this moment using wood as a structural material. And the effect, as I said, is to avoid emissions for example, producing cement or steel. The ballpark estimate of this is that for every cubic meter of timber that replaces 1 cubic meter of concrete, we are saving emissions of about 1 ton of CO2. There are also a lot of talks, and this was also mentioned by James Key, about bioenergy. So about using wood and woody biomass or plant biomass for producing energy to burn, producing heat, or even electric energy. And there is a very high debate, both at a scientific, political, and also grassroots level, on whether this is in climate strategy or not. Let me give you some information, some insight on this. The energy consumption, the energy demand in Europe is projected certainly to increase. And also the use of wood is projected to increase precisely to satisfy this energy demand that we will have in the future. So there's no discussion on this. It's very, I mean, it's a nice mind exercise to discuss about limitation, the how do you say, the opposite of growth, degrowth, or saving energy or energy efficiency. These are all perfectly good strategies, but in fact, all projections tell us that energy demand will increase. So we must find ways to meet this demand sustainably and without harming the climate. Burning wood, in fact, is not climate neutral, is not carbon neutral, because when you burn wood, the carbon contained in the wood goes up into the atmosphere. We have already said this when we were talking about deforestation. So what's the secret here? What's the issue? Well, the fact is that you should be able to account for the regrowth of vegetation. So you harvest a forest, and if you harvest a forest that was already outside its optimum range for photosynthetic efficiency, so it was older than this age, then you are setting back the clock for the forest, and you are preparing it to absorb carbon in a more efficient way. So the carbon that you immediately add when burning wood can be reabsorbed by the regrowing vegetation. This is in theory. Of course, in practice, it's not always like that. It really depends on what's the age of the forest that you harvest, what's the climate like, so how fast can the forest grow back, and also the kind of fuel that you are replacing. If you are doing this, for example, in place of burning coal, well, then you have a chance of being having the upper hand for the climate, for carbon emissions. But there are other fossil fuels, or even the other renewable energy sources, such as solar or geothermal or wind, that of course have a much better carbon balance than even biomass. So you have to take a lot of things into account. And most of all, remember, what's your counterfactual? So what are you replacing? What are you using wood for? What are you replacing? And there's a concept that is very important. It's called the carbon offset parity point. So when burning wood, what you are creating a carbon debt towards the climate. So you are emitting carbon that you then hope to reabsorb later on, just as repaying a debt. And until you come to a point where you have overall lower emissions than you had having used fossil fuels. And this is called the carbon offset parity point. All that matters is when this point comes. We are already at a very severe time. It's a very severe point with our climate change. We cannot afford to wait a very long time for our carbon parity. So this is where the bulk of the heated discussions on using biomass energy is. We can't wait too long. If the carbon parity time is short, then yes, maybe biomass energy can have a role. For all situations when we have to wait too long, or where carbon reabsorption is uncertain, for example, due to the increasing disturbances, well, then we should better use other renewable energy sources. strategy for substitution effect. This is what the European Union recommends in its forest strategy, which is about to be reviewed at the beginning of next year. It's what is called the cascading use of wood. So we need wood. We need it to produce objects also like this behind me. But the climate smartest way to use wood is to use it for long-term uses. This bookshelf behind me is storing carbon for a long time, has been stored carbon for maybe 10 years, and will continue to do so, I hope, for the next 10 or 20 years at least. So first, if you have to use wood, use it for long-term products that can store carbon for a long time. The leftover of this process, what would not have any other use and would probably decompose anyway, so emitting carbon in the atmosphere, then you can use for burning and to produce energy. So bioenergy, yes, but better using leftovers than not what is called virgin wood, so whole trees. And in fact, studies carried out in other countries show that the longer term wood are the ones that are associated to the best climate effect. So the structural building is much better than all other uses of wood because it stays there, carbon stays there for a very long time. So to sum up, of course, there are a lot of uncertainties, ways in which carbon can be accounted for, and the issue is quite complex, but these are the main facts that we have to consider when we develop a forest-based mitigation strategy. So let me sum up the 10 commandments of forest-based climate mitigation. First, wherever you can, try to improve forest growth. That means, for example, carry out a thinning to stimulate growth in forest if the growth is stagnating, or use faster growing species if the trade-off with biodiversity allow. Second, this should be obvious, but it's not, avoid deforestation. So avoid losses and intended losses by replacing forest with other land uses. This is what I mean by deforestation, just the forest disappears forever. Number 3, use wood for long-term products where carbon can be stored for a long time. Number 4, related to this, reduce wood losses. So use efficient processes when you have and if you have to use wood. Just minimize the waste products. Number 5, maximize substitution effects. So remember that wood can be used effectively while storing carbon in place of other materials that at the opposite emit carbon. So try to maximize these effects. 6, burn or burn residues to produce energy, not leaving them to decompose and emit CO2 anyway. At least let's produce energy with them. 7, preserve high biomass forest. So old forests, of course, are not so efficient in absorbing more carbon that they have, but they already have a lot. They are very large sinks, very large deposits of carbon. We cannot afford to lose them. We cannot afford for that carbon to go back into the atmosphere. So preserve. 8, consider climate change effects on carbon sequestration. The forest sink is not stable. There are fears that it will decrease. So when carrying out projections of your forest or of the whole planet, take into consideration the fact that the sink may in fact decrease. 9, increase the resistance and resilience to extreme events. Try to avoid losses by fire, losses by wind, by using the best available science and best available forest management and planning to try to improve the chance of trees to survive to these kind of events. And 10, improve the sustainability of forest change and most of all forest planning. So planning is crucial in making all these other 9 points possible, because we cannot just go to the forest whenever we need to and take some trees, because we wouldn't have any idea of the effects of our action. We have to make a plan, and a long-term plan, because forests take a long time growing, and we have to take into account the risk of fire, the effects of climate change, the demand of energy. All these things have to converge into a meaningful long-term sustainable forest planning. And that is my bottom line message. Thank you.
So thank you, Giorgio. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Now we have a few time for questions. So if you feel to ask some questions to Giorgio, you can use the question and answer functionality, or eventually take the floor. Just like raise up the hand if you want to intervene and ask something to Giorgio. Let's give up 10 to 15 minutes, and then maybe we can stop here and go to the next talk that we have for this morning. In the meanwhile, I share the documents with you, both by email and also in the chat. But the floor is yours to question and intervention on the Giorgio's talks. So I saw that one question has come in. Yes, this is made for me. Can you share the presentation of Giorgio with us? Can we share, Giorgio, the presentation?
Yeah, sure. I'm sending now to your account,
Okay.
and you can share them wherever you deem appropriate.
Thank you very much. Let's see if there are other questions. Don't be shy. Take the chance that Giorgio is with us. Okay, I just make one question to Giorgio. You show very clearly which is the role of forest for also carbon storage and so on. Do you think that there could be like a competition with agriculture for this kind of solution, or do you think that there are solutions that can integrate the two? And in the meanwhile, I'll just send you the message for, we just have a question from Henry, and I just tell you so we can make the same response.
Yes, I'm seeing the question. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead. Okay, if you want to respond.
In terms of yes, in terms of can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of win-win strategies, so trade-off with agriculture, there's a lot of talk about agroforestry and agro-pasture or silvopasture, sorry, as a climate mitigation solution. And in fact, there are several situations where crops or pastures can be and stay productive even below a light tree cover. We're talking, for example, of shade-tolerant crops. The main example here would be coffee, which is really effectively grown below a tree canopy cover, so in the shade of trees. In fact, it's much better in the shade of trees than in full open, in the full light. And coffee is one of the main deforestation crops in the world. So there are already a lot of scientific evidences that this kind of agroforestry can in fact preserve at least a part of the forest cover and preserve the stink instead of being associated to deforestation. This of course has to be explored more, but think also about cattle grazing. And in a lot of different parts of the world, cattle grazing has the potential to be carried out even below a light tree cover. So instead of just deforesting completely and eliminating forest cover just to make room for a pasture, you can effectively bring your animals into the forest. Of course, this must be designed in a very effective way. You cannot just do that because the animals can be detrimental to the forest. So with the right kind of trees, you can still allow the grass to grow, any animals to go and have a safe and cool pasture, in fact. Regarding asking about what it means to maximize substitution effects. So it means basically two things. One, as I said, is increasing the time, so the duration of your wood products. The longer, the better for carbon sequestration. The second is to try and use wood to replace carbon-intensive materials. There are a lot of new technological developments, and Northern European countries, so Scandinavian countries, are leading in these globally, that are learning to use wood, for example, to produce biochemicals, to produce textiles, clothes, shoes, made with fibers made of wood. There are technological breakthroughs that are trying to use wood also as a semi-transparent material. So in perspective, to replace glass. And this is, of course, a very technologically intensive development. But carbon intensive the material you replace for, the better use of wood you are doing. So these are the two pillars of wood effects. And I see we have a third question from Hafiz. He asks, or she asks, if it's wise to do forestation on lands that are not originally forested, like forestation in deserts. So the slide that I've shown about the amount of global land available for tree planting already took out some places where it's not wise to plant a lot of trees. For example, agricultural areas, to avoid the kind of competitions that we were talking about a few minutes ago. Yes, deserts, because it's quite impossible to plant trees there. But for example, a heavy criticism is that they included savanna. But there are a lot of good reasons for keeping savannas as they are, for not increasing the tree cover in savannas, because the balance of grass and trees, we like it as it is, because it supports biodiversity, it supports several ecosystem services from grasslands. We don't want more trees and less grass. So in fact, we have to take out more hectares and more global land from the estimates that you've seen. Another place where it's not smart to plant trees, it's boreal forests. And this is for a different climate effects that is based on physical consequences, mainly albedo. So the amount of sunlight that is reflected or absorbed by the land surface. And Arctic boreal areas are usually covered in snow. Snow has a very white color, so it reflects sunlight very effectively. And that contributes to keep surface temperature low. If we plant a lot of trees there, we tend to darken the color of the land cover. We tend to decrease the snow that settles on the ground. And so this darker land, instead of reflecting sunlight, is absorbing a much higher amount of sunlight. And so this heats up the land just by the same effect that you can experiment when you enter a blue car or a black car in a hot summer day. So CO2 is not the only way in which trees affect climate. CO2 is another way. There are also other ways in specific parts of the world. So everything must be taken into account. Giancarlo asks, what's the role of grasslands in carbon storage compared with the use of forests? I don't know if I have time to answer this last one.
Yes. Go ahead.
Quick. Try to be quick. So also grasslands have photosynthetic vegetation, and they have a specific kind of vegetation that a very high rate between below ground and above ground components. So in simpler words, grass has a lot of roots, and in these roots, a lot of carbon can be stored. Usually less than what can be absorbed by a forest, but there are a lot of areas in the world that don't have enough rain to grow a forest, but they are good for growing a grassland, for having a, so, and these grasslands are very common, are immense tracts of land globally covered by grasslands. So, and that's why the first slide that I've shown had the carbon pools in vegetation exceeding 2,000 billion tons of carbon, of which forests only played maybe 25 or 30%, because the rest were basically mostly grasslands.
Okay, thank you very much, Giorgio. Now we are closing the session. Thank you very much for your insight and for the time.
Thank you for having me.
And so I will invite you also to follow up the agenda when you want. You are always welcome. I also share with you the document if you want also to put your inputs that are very valuable. Really feel free to do that. So now let's close this session. Thank you. And I'll share in the chat the link to the next session that will be properly on agroforestry. So you have received also by email the link. So let's jump in the other call. And in 5 minutes, we will start with Alessandro Di Donna that properly will talk about agroforestry techniques. So see you in the next call, and thank you very much for being here at Climate Social Forum.